Hi, this is Richard Grieco for RunItOnce.com, and this is going to be part 9, the penultimate part of my 10k Scoop PLO MTT hand history review. All the hijinks from the end of the last session are over and done with. We're now in the money, and typically that means that just a lot of people get their stacks in the middle in pretty rapid order. Normally a protracted bubble creates a lot of kind of like 10, 12, 15 big blind stacks like Uberschirms and Rui. So I would anticipate reasonably high kind of like near-term volatility. And to that end, we're definitely not opening. Like, if anything, we're probably opening a little bit tighter than Chip EV here. But this hand is going to be a good enough button RFI, even if I'm looking to play a little bit cautiously. Get it through. And next hand, we're going to open a little bit light into Limmonster. I think this is okay. Firstly, Uberschirms behind only has 10 big blinds, so it's not like I'm facing two essentially equivalent stacks behind, both of whom I could end up in a confrontation with were I to initiate kind of like a higher variance line than limping or just folding. Secondly, I can expect to face like relatively low pre-flop 3-bet frequency from Limmonster. Like, if you were to compare solver output 3-bet frequencies in his position and like real world in the money in a 10k 3-bet frequencies, they wouldn't bear a great deal of resemblance to one another. So given that I'll face lower aggression, given that Uberschirms is short behind me, I think it's a reasonable spot to open a little bit wider. I will say that I seem to have used my sort of larger preset button 2.67 as opposed to my sort of default, which is a little bit less than 2.5x. If I'm expanding my range, as was briefly alluded to actually last time around as well, there's no particular reason to increase my sizing and my RFI frequency at the same time. Otherwise, that just has like a compounding effect that ends up me, well, putting too much money in the middle. We get defended. And on the flop, so how this typically works, if this were a spot you had in like a cash game, or early on in a tournament, but with the same SPR somehow, is that you normally bet the hands with the best backdoors, like 2 backdoor flush draws or a nut backdoor flush draw, whatever else. Because typically, if you get check raised, you're going to be cooling. So you want a range that can do okay under those conditions. The difference here is that Limmonster is going to be check raising super tight, I would assume. I mean, I'm not making like these assumptions pre-flop and on the flop because I think he's like a nit or anything. Like, he's a PLO reg. It's just that the nature of the circumstance is going to disincline him from getting out of line at as much of a frequency or as high of a frequency as he may in, like, if this were just some random cash game. So given that I think he's check raising a little less often, my concern then becomes, I think I do better betting the hands that have the worst job or do the worst job performing against turn probe. Because if I have a 2 backdoor flush draw combination and the turn is whatever, and he probes, then on average my hand will do okay against turn probe, because I'll have turned a backdoor flush draw half the time, I'll have turned a straight some of the time, I'll turn a queen or a 10 some of the time. A combination like this does a lot worse against turn probe, because most often it's just queen high still. So I think you flip the cash game strategy in this spot and you bet the worst combinations. Because I'm not intending to bet and get this in as I would be under other conditions. I'm intending to bet fold it. And if I'm intending to bet fold it, then I want to bet the combinations that have the lowest EV in the check line. And a combination with only one backdoor flush draw, it's a tri-suit and it's non-nutted, would be a clear example of one of those. Over in Solverland, or I guess in this instance, Visionville. Actually, this is a pretty good example of why it's always important to, when you're looking through a solver output, try and get to the heart of why something is happening, rather than just kind of take a mental note that it is. Because if we look at what's happening with our 7-6 combinations here, button versus big blind, obviously pre-flop range is going to be a little bit different. SPR is slightly different, but like the general trend is pretty clear, I think. With our 7-6 combinations, when we have either no backdoor flush draw at all, or a backdoor flush draw with 3 of that suit, then we weight our action towards checking. Every time we have exactly one backdoor flush draw with exactly 2 of that suit, or a double backdoor flush draw, we do a lot more betting than checking. So in general terms, we have a clear preference for taking more aggressive action with our stronger hands. But that's largely a factor of when we get check raised, we're mixing our 7-6 between just calling and getting the money in, which is very much not my intention versus check raise in this hand. Like, if I think Limb Monster's check raising a much tighter range, then this hand has, well, most 7-6 actually that isn't like 8-7-6 or whatever, has pretty bad equity. Obviously, in a tournament, also there's incentive to avoid confrontations in marginal situations. And so I'm going to be bet folding. And given that I'm going to be bet folding, I want to weight my aggression towards the weaker combinations, because those are the combinations where the value of the alternative option, that being checking, is the lowest, because they're less effective at absorbing turn aggression, because they have less equity in raw terms. So we go with bet, and Limb Monster calls. We turn the nuts, and I'm going to go with small bet, or small double barrel. I think this is pretty good. He's obviously not folding any straight, and he has quite a lot of straights, so the hands I'm trying to fold him off are mostly pretty weak. Also, it's kind of hard for most of my bluffs to have much equity. Like, I can have some gut shots and stuff, but I don't really have any high equity semi-bluffs, so I'm pretty... Well, I either have a straight or I have a hand that doesn't have much equity against a straight, basically, and as such, I'm somewhat incentivized to play small bet, kind of cheaply fold him off the bottom of his range. And that's especially true when the SPR is such that if I pick this sizing on turn, I still create a river SPR, which enables me to shove and get all the money in if I so choose. I had a look at this spot in the solver and ran into a couple of interesting things. Firstly, imposition in this spot has a very high bet frequency, essentially 3/4 of the time, almost exclusive preference for the small sizing. And there's a lot of betting going on with essentially every region of their range, with one specific exception. If we have a straight, then we're basically always betting. A little bit of checking of the 7-6 combinations over on the left there. If we have a potential bluffing hand, like one pair with a gutter, so the 8-7 gutter, the 8-6 gutter, maybe something like 7-4, so like a board pair plus gutter, we're doing a heavy amount of betting. So we're betting a lot of our best and worst hands, which is no particular surprise, but we're also doing a lot of betting with what could be potentially described as like a merged region, a mid-strength region. Filtering by 2-pair in sets, these hands are betting nearly half the time, and every single time when we have a 7 blocker to remove some straights. And I think this is kind of interesting. I wouldn't have anticipated such a large kind of merged frequency here. The objective seems to be to bet like a low 2-pair combination and fold our opponent off 1 pair with overcards, because like running it down the bet line, if we just give him 2-pair plus, he's never folding. Worse than 2-pair, folding at a reasonable frequency. So this bet is a lot about making, we bet our ace king 5-4 and he folds like one of these hands over here, like jack 10 10-3, which could maybe bluff us on some rivers. It has outs against us, but it's never going to continue against a bet, and so we can make whatever equity it has worth nothing, and so on and so forth. And because they'll have worse than a straight half the time, then a small bet is pretty effective at targeting that region. The small bet itself is also noteworthy because pulling up the equity graph, imposition has an equity disadvantage here, but a polarity advantage. And when those two things are the case, the player considering the bet typically has a heavy preference for the large sizing, because were they to use the small sizing, their opponent can defend pretty easily against it. Their equity advantage means that they have just a lot of reasonably strong hands. And the use of the large sizing is typically to leverage the fact that you will have more nutted hands than your opponent, which we in this instance do. I think this is a good example of not blindly adhering to rules, like perceiving rules, building a list of things that are always the case and then considering them to be ironclad. We always have to view them in the wider context of the hand. Like, yes, you normally make large bets if you have a polarity advantage, but is making a large bet here really the best way to leverage the fact that you have a polarity advantage? Well, not really, because firstly, if we make a large bet, we're going to risk making a lot of our bluffs unprofitable, because as you just saw, out of position has worse than a straight half the time, and it doesn't take a degree in mathematics to know that means that they have a straight the other half of the time, and they're not folding a straight ever, because apparently they're not folding two pair or better, like literally any 1% of the time. So our bluffs become unprofitable if we size up. We stop getting value with a lot of our pretty strong hands. And also, the large sizing ultimately is about making sure that we can get all the money in by the river. And if we pick the small sizing here, we still get to make an all-in bet on the river because the turn SPR is only 2. If I make the SPR 4, as I've done here, now we have a lot of interest. I mean, the equities and polarities are identical because the ranges I input were the same. But changing the SPR means that imposition now has far more incentive to use the larger sizing, because they need to use the larger sizing in order to get all the money in with their nutted hands. And because the SPR is larger, their polarity advantage also increases in relevance. Typically speaking, polarity increases in relevance along with the SPR. And as the SPR decreases, it becomes more equity driven, essentially. Like if you imagine a turn SPR of like 0.1, then it really doesn't matter who has more nutted hands. It's just like who has more hands that can continue against like a 10% of the pot all in bet. So yeah, a lot of merge betting at SPR2. At SPR4, as you might imagine, based on our sizing preferences, there's a lot less of that, like better than 2 pair, not better than straight, is basically checking every single time. And now like we still use our bluffs, we still use our 8-6, 8-7, 7-4, that kind of stuff. But we stop betting our merge combinations, and we also, as a necessity based on the fact that we're using a large sizing, start checking more straights, because like a lot of wheel straights don't really achieve much by going in a full pot size range. So yeah, there's value and utility to large sizing at deeper SPRs, but in this instance, not particularly here. We just want to do a lot of betting, leverage the fact that we have more nutted hands, compel our opponent to continue with a wider range, and then potentially barrel them off it on the river, because our polarity advantage will be of some use to us in folding them off some marginal bluff catches on that street. The one hand that we, as in position at the shallower SPR, have a lot of interest in checking is going to be a strong one pair hand, potentially with a straight draw. So a hand like King 7-3, for example, is basically always, or literally always, going to check. A lot of Broadway pairs, like better than 10-10, not better than Deuce 3. These are all essentially all checking, except when they have like an Ace-6 combination for extremely relevant blockers. So you wouldn't go too far wrong at the shallower SPR to bet all of the time, unless you had literally a strong one pair combination. All of the rest benefit in one way or another from putting a little bit of money into the pot. Monster calls, and we head to the river. River pairs the board. He checks to us. And with SPR below 1, I think our hand is a pretty clear shove. He's continuing every straight on the turn, so he has a decent amount of wheel and 6 high straights as bluff catchers. He can potentially shove some full houses. I actually think he shoves quite a few full houses on river because he can expect me to check back quite a lot of wheel and 6 high straights again. Especially in like a tournament environment where I might be a little bit more conservative, considering making a bet that's essentially for my entire stack, or at least the vast majority of it. I can see him bluffing some 5-4 as well, otherwise he doesn't really have any bluffs. And it's an okay spot, not an amazing one. So basically, once he checks, he has kind of a diluted quantity of full houses, all of his straights, and probably all of his like king 7-3 that likely continued on turn. So against that range, this hand is a pretty clear value bet still. And I think shove is the best option. In game, I go with 380. So there are a couple of things here. It's possible there was a payout jump, and I was trying to induce action from hands that would have folded, rather than like call and potentially bust on the bubble. Let's say there's a 100k stack at the other table. Lim Monster probably calls a little bit wider against 380, knowing that if he loses the pot to me, he still has a stack that can potentially ladder to the next pay jump. The problem with that logic is it's very transparent, because if I'm trying to make it less painful for him to call, then that's not normally something you do when you have a bluffing combination. Another thing it could be is a concept that, like, if two sizings are very close in EV, then you should probably use the smaller one because it creates less stack volatility. It's probably better to play smaller pots on average if you're not actually gaining EV by playing larger ones. And I think that would be an incorrect application of that idea, because the two sizings aren't close in EV. Like, I just have a very clear shove. He has to call, I think, most 6 high straights, maybe some wheel straights against shove. So it's either a pay jump thing, the incorrect application of that concept, or leveling game of some kind, or just clumsiness. But in any event, I think shoving is a superior line. Like, I don't block any full houses, but that's not massively relevant in this instance. He does call a wheel. I don't know if that would have folded versus shove. I think he might need to call some wheels. Probably does. I don't think this is a spot I'm going to be particularly trigger happy with. I have kind of broken down his range and said, well, he doesn't have a full house basically ever. Or at least he doesn't have a full house very often. But I still don't know if I'm going to pick this spot to barrel off with some random, I don't know, 5x or something. But who knows? I've certainly done crazier stuff. Anyway, we chip up nicely. Folds to us. I think this is very standard RFI. Like, I guess I could do something different. Well, I can't fold. I guess I could limp, but like strong high card strength with a suited ace, winning quite a lot of EV to just open. Same kind of thing here. Like ace jack 10 with a nut suit is a very high EV combination. I get the chance by opening to sometimes play a large pot in position against the other big stack, so pretty clear RFI. And here we defend against Bryn and go with lead on 10-5 deuce. I think this is pretty good with a tri-suited flush draw, like a pretty decent combo draw. The tri-suit is an effective choice of kind of semi-bluff because the EV of checking is lower. My hand doesn't make quite as good a check raise with a non-nut flush draw and 3 of a suit, just because it has less raw equity against the range that will bet and get it in against me. Also, when I check and I had 3 diamonds, he c-bets at a lower frequency, and I don't really want this to check through, and the turn is like, the 8 of clubs or something like that. So yeah, more fold equity with a bet, less raw equity with a check. I think this is pretty decent lead. Obviously, you get more leads at shallow or SPR and so on and so forth. If there's like a whole bunch of payout pressure, I guess we can RFI this hand. I don't hate just folding. Limping can't be that bad. We go with limp. I assume anticipating a marginally more passive than typical ISO strategy. I think just folding is probably the best option, to be honest, with disconnected hand. Maybe limp the king high suit, stuff like that. Anyway, we got ISO and obviously fold. Not doing basically any folding with this hand class, like double suited, strongish ace-x with a bunch of Broadway cards. Yes, we're dominated by a lot of the value hands he's 3-betting, but we just have too much equity with a hand like this, and yeah, we just basically have to call and see a flop. Flop absolutely nothing, he shoves, we fold. I think I like just opening here. Got into small blind limping and stuff in previous content, but this seems like a hand that benefits quite a bit from going for the straight steal. Flop a complete airball. I think just checking to give up. We have a bunch of other hands we'd rather use as bluffs. We block a load of the hand. Like, if we assume he's 3-betting quite a lot of his, like, you know, ace, king, king, ace, king, like that kind of thing, then his air cards start to contain a lot of kind of like cards of these ranks, basically. So, like, he's going to have some amount of a piece of this at a reasonable frequency, I think. And we're also out, like, it's not like I want to see bet large. If I see bet small, he peels a bunch, and then, like, our hand isn't set up to double barrel that aggressively, and so on and so forth. So, just check an airball, give up. I think this is a pretty reasonable ISO. I think it's pretty standard, rather, ISO. It's easy to slip into limping a range that is somewhat vulnerable to being ISO'd, i.e. doesn't contain, like, strongish component that can limp re-raise and stuff. I can also exert some reasonable amount of tournament pressure, I assume, and this hand doesn't play well post-flop, so going for the pre-flop steal seems like it's kind of like a good fit. And we get it through. If I'm limping the king 7-6-3, I think limping this hand is probably reasonable. Like, the king 7-6-3 is probably on the loose side. This is borderline okay, I think, with more solid connectivity and a higher suit. Kind of curious, though. Do a quick checkup. Yeah, basically limping the single and tri-suited combinations, opening the double-suited, folding the rainbow. Seems pretty reasonable. And then versus ISO, continuing the queen high suit, so pattern's pretty clear there. And it's possible in position against limp in this sim is going to be ISOing. Actually, around about a third of the time is probably about what I'd expect. So yeah, go with the limp, and this time see flop in a limped pot. No interest at all in betting this board. Very connected, complete airball. I think we get a fair amount more aggression here with a queen in our hand. It's a little bit of an insurance policy against running into as many combinations of queen jack. Also, unblocking all of the pairs just makes it very easy for him to have, like, jack 9, which probably calls, or 10-8, which always calls, and so on and so forth. So, bet for one sizing or another. And we're obviously checking quite a few rivers. This is one that we can for sure value bet, and I think we're kind of polar by this stage. So, like, the objectives we have when we bet are probably to make a hand like 10-9, 10-8 indifferent. Well, it doesn't really have 10-9, so I guess like 10-8 and stuff like that. And generate as much value as we can against his ace-x hand class, which I think is broadly always calling, unless it's like ace-x 2-pair with awful removal. So, large-ish seems like the play. Trying to think if you want to value bet any non-straight hands. I guess like some flopped sets, maybe. So, probably don't want to go full pot. Like flopped sets with useful straight blockers kind of thing. So yeah, like largish sub-pot sizing seems good fit for the strategy I have in mind. And that's more or less what I think I'd have done now. Kuresh opens on the button. It's a pretty easy fold, I think, in a cash game environment. You get to call a fair amount wider, as I've said, in the small blind in a rake-free game when you're facing smaller pre-flop sizings. I don't hate going for a 3-bet, following on from conversation in the last installment about how 3-bet ranges work. If we're on a payout bubble, for example, then this would be a reasonable hand to put in a 3-bet range. It's not doing terribly for raw equity against a button opening range, even if we say that he's opening maybe like 30% or so. We can for sure generate some folds. Yeah, I think we have to VP at this hand. I think it's close between calling and 3-betting. Maybe I slightly lean towards calling, unless we're on a pure bubble, because currently we have a reasonable stack size dynamic going on at our table, and maybe I don't want to take a thin-ish spot that potentially endangers that. That's a small factor, but I think it's closer between calling and 3-betting, and so something like that makes me a little bit happier about going with the conservative option. I think 3-betting is for sure an option, though. If I thought he was opening 100 big blind button range, I think 3-betting becomes a pretty good play. We go with call, get squeezed, and obviously fold. This seems like a pretty good hand to be limping with. Reasonably connected, tri-suited. The king in a hand blocks a few 3-bets. We don't have an ace, so yeah, seems like a reasonable fit for a limping range. And we flop the nuts. Basically always betting, I think. Checking some 8-5, so betting all our 10-8 seems reasonable. Shams calls. Yeah, I think continuing to bet here with a 7 especially would be reasonable. I don't know that we get paid by that much weaker stuff. If he has a 6, it's tricky for him not to have a 9 or a 7 with it. And if he just has Jack 10-9, that can likely fold. So I'm not sure we get a lot of value by betting, except against 8-5, which we can just get a bet in against on the river. So given that it's a rainbow board, we're not really denying equity to anything. It's not clear that we're getting value against anything. If we are getting value against something, it's going to be a one street kind of value deal where they call turn and mostly fold rivers. So I can just flip that and get the value on the river, and have some strongish hands in my turn checking range as a useful side benefit. Maybe I induce a bluff from a hand that would have folded versus turn barrel, that kind of thing. On the river, he goes with full pot, and I think we kind of have to call here. It's not a spot that's exciting. It's tough for him to have bluffs when he calls on flop on this texture and multi-way with a player still behind. He can be value betting the same hand as me, though, is the thing. To this action, maybe not for this sizing, although it's possible, but it's not inconceivable that he's value betting a 10-8 combination, and you don't typically get to do much folding if someone could be value betting the hand that you're considering folding. If I am ever going to fold 10-8, obviously it would be most likely combinations without a board pair blocker. So if I am going to, if I think that he struggles to find bluffs in this spot, then maybe I can fold the 10-8 with no pair blockers, but I think I'm kind of stuck calling here, because it's possible that he's going to turn a hand like Jack 10-9-3 into a bluff. Jack 10-9-5, I guess, would probably be a slightly better one. But I don't think he's going to do that every time. Maybe he is because he's conscious of the fact that he's going to need to bluff that hand in order to be bluffing enough. But by that logic, I unblock him having that hand. So, like, if one of the more likely bluffs he can have is a hand that I unblock, then that generally suggests that I need to be calling this particular hand. Like, you just don't typically see bluffs with this action at this stage of a 10k. But that's not a line of that's a line of reasoning that might lead me to slightly overfold this spot. And I think if I fold this hand, it's like I'm folding at least 3/4 of my range. So we go with call, and he has a full house. Doing well against Dubershirms so far this series. I think this. I mean, if there's payout pressure on Bryn, I can like we're on a bubble. I can live with this being an open. I don't hate limping it with the nut suit, but like I think it's close between all three basically, and tournament dynamics can likely have a pretty strong influence as to the preferred course of action. I think limp is probably going to be the option that's most plus EV at the lowest frequency. Like, I can see spots where opening does well, I can see spots where folding's fine. Limping is kind of like a particular set of circumstances where I think they're playing relatively passively versus limps, and I just want to see flops in position. It's possible that I just wanted to see flops in position. There were a few limping spots so far. And like maybe for whatever reason I decided that was a good fit for the table that I was at, and I'll defer to the me who was in the moment on that one. But yeah, this seems like a hand that I probably want to raise or fold. Dubershirms ISOs, we never limp fold in position, so we're not going to start now. And we fold versus one big blind on a board where we flop absolutely nothing. Yeah, like I do seem to have a liking. I mean, we've now gone down to what I assume is 2 tables of 6. So let's say we're currently here. So yeah, one thing is that I am now the player who is covered by both parties who are still potentially contesting the pot. So maybe I just don't want to build big pots on a pay jump. This hand is like an okay limp. Again, I think that if I'm maybe playing a bit snug in response to there being a pay jump, it could also be like someone's busted at the other table. We've already made the 41k though, so not entirely sure of that. In any event, I think this is kind of close. I don't like opening this hand, I will say that. And maybe I think that I'm doing reasonably well post-flop, although both of these guys are regs, so it's not like if I do think that, then it's certainly not by very much. Pretty good flop for me when he doesn't ISO to this action. Betting, like, I can get called by worse. I can fold out 6x. Backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw, that kind of stuff. I think betting's pretty reasonable. I think I'm doing a lot of betting on a heavy Broadway when he checks, basically. And so I remember double barreling. I think this is pretty good under certain stipulations. Like, I don't think this is good if I don't think he ever folds a hand like Queen 6, Queen 3. I kind of do think he might do those things though. A hand like, Queen 7, Queen 8, 7, 6, for example, isn't doing fantastically in terms of realizing equity against a range that wants to polarize on a turn like this. And I block him having improved, like, to a hand that's to a flush draw, obviously, by having 3 hearts. And my hand is also, like, it could still be the best hand. I don't think I get called by weaker very often, but But I could have a hand that's like I have a hand for sure that's doing reasonably well against his range, and if I think I can fold him off some slightly better hands, which I feel like would have been my assumption, I think this is a pretty reasonable line. Very standard open. Pretty standard ISO. I don't think cutoff limp's much of a thing in general, particularly off like a 15, 16 big blind stack. Limp folds. Like, you shouldn't be doing much limp folding in position, and I'm not sure that you gain much by having a limping range around 16 big blinds as a non-small blind player. Obviously 3-betting. This is thin. I think it gets to be a defend. You just defend so much against like 2.2x in a rake-free environment. I feel like a queen high suit is for sure a defend. I don't have 2.2x, but I'm going to do a quick check up against 2.5 and see if the EV can give an indication. Okay, so cutoff opens 23% of the time. That seemed about what I'd expect. I mean, like, as I understand it, he's a very good player, and the category of good player who is just annoying in the infrequency with which they make mistakes. So I wouldn't expect to see anything different. And we're just defending a whole bunch against like 80. Like we're defending 80% of the time against a tightish range that opens to a larger sizing. So I'm having trouble seeing how our hand doesn't get to be a continue. But we'll just start out with any queen 9 that's single suited and doesn't have an ace king or pair. Looks like we're folding the deuces basically. So yeah, what if I take out the deuces and the threes? Then we start to continue basically everything apart from the lowest suits. Interesting that we fold the queen 9-8. That could be like a little bit of a solver thing. Queen 9-8 seems a better continue than queen 9-5. Yeah, who knows? Maybe that would have switched up, or maybe it was just super close. Like a lot of these hands seem very close to indifferent. None of them are. Once you get down to the hands that resemble my hand class, they're all pretty close to indifferent. We're a little bit deeper than 25 big blinds. Don't think that changes things much. Like, it's not like 30 big blinds is some magic number where you get to VPIP a lot more or a lot less. And against this side, I think I more or less want to play chip EV versus just like a small RFI. Trim the very weakest hands that that realize equity the least effectively post flop. But this seems like an okay candidate. And flop checks through. I think probing turn for one sizing or another. We have a reasonable amount of just immediate fold equity on this texture. We also have a double gutter and a pair and like an overcard and bunch of stuff like that, so I don't really think we want to check our hand. Like in position checks back at a reasonable frequency, but giving them a delay c-bet opportunity when we have a hand that will be not to overuse the term, but kind of close to indifferent against that delay c-bet seems like a poor option. We also block like the very strongest hands, and we have some nut outs. So yeah, I'm going to go with bet for one sizing or another. Presence or absence of a club, like the fact that we don't have a club kind of makes me want to bet small and pick the club combination to go large with. I don't think it matters a whole lot. Like, I don't hate going large with just all of them. If I were going to mix within the hand class, then I think that's the way in which I would do it. He calls, we turn enough showdown value, or we river enough showdown value not to need to continue bluffing. And yeah, standardly played, I think. I mean, you can maybe fold this hand on turn. It's a little bit sticky to call this hand on turn. Like, if he had a hand maybe like Queen 5-6 that is more vulnerable in terms, like, my semi-bluffs have more equity against, and also blocks a few of my bluffs, then probably that's a fold. You do tend to see aces getting continued the most out of all the overpairs, even when the overpairs are identical in terms of like being currently ahead or currently behind, just because they have the most equity against a semi-bluff region. Like if he has king 6-5 and I've bet ace 9 5-4, then I have extra outs compared to if I have that same hand, but he now has ace 6-5. Anyways, pretty close either way. I think I probably fold his hand against this sizing on turn, but it's not a big deal. And we'll call that a wrap for part 9. I'll be back next time with the concluding installment. Hope everyone enjoyed the content. As always, questions, comments, all feedback gratefully received in the thread below or elsewhere. And until next time, this has been Richard Grieco for RunItOnce.com. Take care.